I want to first start, as we always do, with an acknowledgement of the traditional owners of this land, the Jagera and Turrbal people. As we always do, we think about how we sit on the banks of the Brisbane River, the Maiwar, and we think about how it is our duty as citizens of this city to protect the natural environment in which we sit. And so the Law Futures Centre has a couple of themes. One is about law and global change and the protection of human rights and better governance. And I don't know if any of you are looking at the State of the Union address by Trump today, but that's fairly relevant. And the second theme is around law and nature. The third theme is around the future of legal education. So that's the centre. And as part of the centre, we also work with ACIPA, the Australian Centre for Intellectual Property and Agriculture, of which Leanne is a member. So we are very interested in the future of governance and the future of human rights and the future of human endeavour, I suppose, and what it means for legal regulation. And so this particular workshop is absolutely perfect. We're going to explore the right to repair. So my job today is merely to introduce your guide in this journey on understanding the new frontiers of intellectual property, and that's to introduce Professor Leanne Wiseman, who is a professor at the Griffith Law School and a intellectual property, I'm trying to think of a word that doesn't mean obsessed, aficionado.
Guru?
Guru, that's better. That's better. She's a guru. And we have this wonderful panel of gurus with her that she's going to introduce you here too. So Leanne, please.
Thank you, Sue. I might just sit here so that we keep it nice and informal tonight. Thank you very much, and thank you again to Griffith, the Arts Education Law Group and the Law Futures Centre for providing the funding to have the opportunity to bring such a high level of expertise together to talk about the right to repair. So the format of this evening, I thought what would be useful is to provide a bit of a context and a bit of background as to the international right to repair movement and that will place where we are here in Australia today, given the developments in the United States and also in Europe as well. So essentially, what I thought I'd firstly like to do by way of introduction is to introduce our wonderful panel of speakers tonight, or panellists. On the left, we have Leah Chan, Professor Leah Chan Brynvold from Suffolk University in Boston, Massachusetts. And Massachusetts is actually the home of the right to repair movement. So we're very pleased to have Leah here joining us tonight to give a US perspective on this discussion. Next to Leah, we have Professor Matthew Rimmer, who is a Professor of Intellectual Property and Innovation Law, Technology Law, yes, at QUT across the river. Matt is a long-time colleague, also in the Australian Centre for Intellectual Property and Agriculture. We've worked together for a very long time. And Matt has expertise in IP and in a whole range of areas, but most recently IP and climate change, IP and 3D printing, and it's from those areas that Matt has come to the right to repair. So, and next to Matthew, we have Professor Graham Austin from the Victoria University of Wellington, and Graham is a very well-known IP expert and copyright expert as well in particular. Also a competition law expert, an expert in a whole range of areas. He also is a professor at the Melbourne Law School and has worked for some time at the University of Arizona in the United States. So he brings a wealth of experience to the right to repair as well from a New Zealand perspective. And on my right, we have Guido Verbist, who is actually the person who set up the Bauer Repair Centre and Recycle Centre in Sydney. And Guido has a huge amount of experience in the practical everyday repair, but also recycling, reuse, but also Guido's been involved in crowdfunding around the right to repair and actually has an online petition at the moment to Josh Frydenberg asking for right to repair legislation in Australia. So, and we'll hear more about that later. And last but certainly not least is Professor Taina Pihajian. Sorry, you can correct me.
Yeah,
Sorry. My Finnish is very bad, I apologise. But Taina has come from the University of Helsinki, where they have an Institute of Environmental Sustainability, and Taina has expertise in the European approach to the right to repair. So I think this is one of the benefits of bringing experts together from different parts of the world, New Zealand, America, and the Nordic country, and also with a European perspective, so that we can, in Australia, learn from essentially some regulatory approaches. So really our focus tonight is looking at, we have a lot of IP expertise in the audience as well as on the panel here tonight, but we acknowledge that the right to repair involves so much more than just intellectual property law and looking at exceptions within those laws. We're acknowledging that there is a whole raft of possibilities with repair, whether it be within the environmental sustainability space, within insurance law, within taxation law, within competition law, consumer rights law, as well as intellectual property. So there's a lot of context that we'd like to talk to you about tonight. And part of our plan is to try and engage you as much as we can in the discussion tonight, so that we can hear from you, and many of you have an interest in repair, whether it be from design or from the actual practice of repair or reuse yourselves. So this is really an open forum for us to have a broad-ranging discussion tonight. So in terms of probably a good place to start, sorry, I might turn around just to check that we're all on the same page, but to start, I'd just like to turn to the Sustainable Development Goals. We know that the UN has set these 17 goals as a goal for itself in terms of all nations to aim towards by 2030, that we seek to attain progress towards each of these goals. And so in terms of where repair fits into the UN Sustainable Development Goals, we're looking at essentially goal number 12 in terms of, as you'll see, repair, reuse, consumption, and all of those environmental kind of goals that we're looking at. So when we take the Sustainable Development Goal, and this is very much where we've talked to Taina about the way that Europe is approaching the right to repair, because they are very much focused on the environmental sustainability, and that is the approach to regulation that they're taking in Europe, and we've got some really good lessons to learn from that. So if we take the next step, looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, part of that is to move away from a linear economy, essentially the jargon of, you take, you make, and you basically waste. The notion of a circular economy is that we basically try to make the most of our natural resources, and so that the economy is basically, we optimise all of our resources and reduce waste. And that is something, as you'll see, along that journey, there is a whole raft of probably stakeholder groups that we're looking at. So what is really important to acknowledge is this debate around the right to repair, it is not a silver bullet, and certainly it's acknowledged that there is so much work from the design sphere about how designers are designing products and devices and goods that can go towards reduction of waste. And Dr. Jessie Adams-Stein from the UTS Design School in October last year held essentially what was the first right to repair discussion in Australia, and that was bringing together designers and a few legal experts and other stakeholders to look at how design can influence repairability. So that's a very important part of this debate. So essentially where we're sitting on the circular economy, again, we're just tonight going to focus on that repair aspect. So there is a lot going on with recycle and reuse, and we acknowledge that, and that has a really important part to play. But tonight we're going to focus our discussion on the right to repair. So if we talk about more generally, we heard this afternoon, alongside tonight, we're actually running an academic workshop today and tomorrow, where we're all looking at different aspects of this right to repair debate. And we heard this afternoon from John Goutsakis and Rose Reid, who are the founders of the E-Waste Watch. And they have been instrumental in the product stewardship legislation that we have in Australia about recycling televisions and computer screens and trying to reduce e-waste. So there's some fantastic work that's being done. And it just, I thought I would show you this kind of information about the amount of e-waste that's being generated by Australia. For example, we are the 4th highest generator of e-waste per capita. So that's 23.6 kilograms per person, or in other words, 574,000 tonnes per annum. And we're also great hoarders. So we have over 250 million mobile phones lying at home, probably in drawers. I know I'm guilty of about 4. Some are broken, some are just very old. So what I thought I'd give you a little bit of background and context, and then I'll open up to the panel and I'll get them to contribute some perspectives, and then we'll open up to some questions from the audience. So what I'd like to talk about essentially now is how did we get here? Why are we talking about a right to repair? For many of us, we probably had that sense of frustration of, for example, I have had in my lifetime 3 fridges. My parents still have the fridge that they were given for their wedding present in 1954, and it still works, and it's a great beer fridge. So there's something really interesting. Every time an ice machine or a seal breaks on my fridge, they replace my fridge, because to replace a door on a fridge is just not economically viable. They'll replace the whole fridge. So I'll end up with a brand new fridge. Whether I like it or not, they won't repair the fridge. So what we're seeing is basically, over the last decade, there's a huge increase in the day-to-day items that we use in our homes and in our lives that now are smart devices. They're embedded with computer chips that will make them robotic or automatic or just function at our convenience. So there's a lot of convenience and upside of this smart tech that we have in our homes and on our farms, for example. But now we have washing machines, coffee machines, dishwashers, toasters, printers, microwaves, refrigerators, and your smartphone, and also your smart car, that basically are devices that you will not be able to repair. In some cases, you cannot even open those devices. The reason you can't repair them is multifaceted, for example. In some cases, and we can use the Apple iPhone as a really good example, they make those phones so that they can't be opened, that the batteries are glued in, for example. So there are physical hurdles to repair that we see. I have lighting in my home, exterior lighting, that you cannot replace a bulb in. When that LED light goes, you buy a whole new light because you can't take the bulb out because it's encased in the light. So what we're seeing now is more and more products that are being built in a way that does not facilitate repair. So there's a physical hurdle. But also what we are seeing, and that's around the design aspect, but also the way in which manufacturers are producing the parts. There's availability of spare parts. In some instances, there are none, or in others, the parts are so expensive that you either spend $700 to get your air conditioner fixed, or you'll pay $800 to get a new one, and everyone will choose to get a new one. So the availability and cost and accessibility of spare parts is a significant issue, as with the availability and access to the technical information that you need to access. So, for example, in your vehicle, your motor vehicle, you can't take your motor vehicle to the local mechanic anymore and get the local mechanic to fix a brand new smart car, because They don't have the diagnostic software, and often they can't access that. So we've seen some reform in Australia around that, and we're looking at that. But in addition to the physical availability of spare parts or the actual physical hardships placed around repair, manufacturers are using their intellectual property rights to lock up the devices even more. So intellectual property, whether it be a patent over the product, a design right over the product, but more likely, and we'll hear more about this tonight, is they're using copyright law because it's the software that's embedded in the technology itself. They have intellectual property rights in the computer software, and they can use what we call technological protection measures to lock up that software to protect it. Now, technological protection measures is an expression in the Copyright Act. In other words, it's a digital lock, essentially. So these laws were developed for copyright owners in the 1990s when they were very concerned about online music and online movies and online videos being downloaded for free. So they were given power to lock up their digital content in a way that prevented people from copying. What we're seeing, though, is the expansion of the use of technological protection measures to do more than just stop people copying the software. They're actually using that TPM to lock up the device full stop. So if we translate this and think about our farmers and agriculture, for example, the last 10, 20 years on farm has really been transformed by digital technologies on farm. So we have sensors, we have tractors that are GPS driven. They are essentially like they have a dash, like an airline, like an aeroplane, for example. So all of these technologies on farm now basically have computer codes in a lot of devices, whether it be a drone, a tractor, a sensor on farm. And so we have the presence of copyright on farm that we've never had before. One of the consequences of this is that John Deere, for example, will say, you don't own your tractor, you have a right to use your tractor. We own the technology that's embedded in your tractor. Not only do we own the information that tractor will gather up, the agricultural data, but we also will stop you from tinkering or modifying your tractor because we own the technology in that tractor. So I came to the right to repair through the work in agriculture that we do in ASIPA because farmers were complaining, particularly in Western Australia, that they couldn't tinker or modify their tractors that were manufactured overseas to accommodate the harsh Australian soil, because once they attempted to tamper with the technology on the tractor, often the system might shut down, or basically they would be breaching their licence agreement if they did so. So we've seen the increasing use of technological protection measures, or in other words, and combined with end user licence agreements. So in this debate about the right to repair, we hear the language of OEMs, the original equipment manufacturers. We hear the arguments about EULAs, that's the end use licence agreement. They're the terms of use that you agree to when you turn on your coffee machine or you switch on your smart car. Those are contracts that you enter into, and those terms of those contracts will govern whether you can repair or not, essentially. So that's where we are, and that is why we've seen such a rise of consumer concern across a whole range of sectors, including the motor vehicle industries, consumers, agriculture and farmers. And so, as I said in the introduction, in 2012, and Leah will tell us more about this perhaps later, the first right to repair legislation was passed in Massachusetts, and it was essentially about sharing car repair information with non-authorised car repairers, for example. So Massachusetts was a watershed moment in 2012. This law essentially became the template that has been used across a whole range for agreements with the car industry as well, but it has also now been used as a template to say, well, if we've got this far, perhaps these provisions could work with consumable items, not just cars, but broader. So what we've seen is essentially from that time in 2012, the Repair Association began, and very strong, powerful lobby groups have rallied around this consumer's right to repair. So if we look at essentially how the Repair Association talks about repair, I like their definition, and that's essentially that the right to repair is for the consumer's right to choose who, what, where, why, when, how, and for how much their equipment is to be repaired. Now, what we acknowledge that it's not everybody who wants to repair their own goods. For example, some of us here may be keen and able and skilled enough. I certainly don't want to repair my own goods, but I do want to have the choice to go to a third party for repairs and not be forced to go back to a manufacturer who charges high service fees or high cost of repairs. So we've seen a fantastic groundswell of support for the right to repair in the United States. John Deere has featured very strongly in the agriculture sphere, and the American Farm Bureau is a very powerful lobby group, and they have been very vocal in support of the right of farmers, the backbone of the American economy, to repair their tractors and to repair their farm equipment. Why shouldn't they? They spend hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars for these pieces of equipment. Why can't they modify or tinker with them, for example? There's a fantastic book if anyone's interested in this area. It's called The End of Ownership. It's written by Professor Aaron Perzanowski, yes, and Professor Jason Schultz. It's an excellent book about this idea that although we physically own these items, the question is really, when we do not have the right to modify, to open, to access these items, is that really ownership? This whole notion of digitally embedded goods with locks over them has really undermined the physical ownership rights that we associate with our goods. So I think, and this is very much the argument that John Deere has run in opposition to the right to repair discussion in agriculture, that you don't actually own your $800,000 tractor, you just have a right to use it, and we own that. So we have people like Carl Wiens, who's set up iFixit. It's a fantastic organisation as well, who has set up essentially a website where he is making available repair manuals for pretty much a whole range of products. So we're seeing essentially this movement spread throughout the United States. There's this great repair manifesto that iFixit had developed. And so essentially, if you look on the slide, you can see you can pretty much put in any product and you'll be able to track down a guide of how to disassemble, how to access, how to repair. So I think this has been, what we've seen in the United States is really interesting for Australia because it's been such a grassroots movement and it's such a consumer rights driven movement. So in 2018, just quickly to take you through the history, from 2014, 15 onwards, every state, this debate has been going on and being picked up at the state level across America. 2018 was a great year. In 2019, we have 20 states of America who have right to repair legislation that's sitting in their legislatures at present. And they are currently being debated. If you follow Twitter, it's great to see there's debate going on as we sit in Maine, in some of the states about this right to repair legislation. So you can see Massachusetts is actually taking another step forward in that they've recognised a car repair, but they're also taking a step forward and looking at extending that to consumables as well. So only currently now there's Bill 107, which is basically an act to enable a digital right to repair for devices and goods as well. So we have Colorado in the United States. Currently lobbying is going on in relation to the right to repair, and we've also just had Hawaii the committee vote unanimously to advance the right to repair. So there's a lot going on in the United States. Even just on the 1st of February, we've got reports that the American Farm Bureau is actually releasing a new policy, a 2020 policy, to revamp up their right to repair. And they're trying to get agreement with the equipment manufacturers about access to technical information and diagnostic information for their farm equipment. And Senator Elizabeth Warren, who's a presidential candidate, is actually proposing not a state-level right to repair, but a national right to repair for agriculture and farmers currently. So the United States is fertile, fantastic ground, and we'll hear more about that. Canada is also on the verge of looking at right to repair legislation. There's work being done in their Competition Bureau. There's very vocal advocates. Scott Smith, who runs Honeybee Manufacturing in Saskatchewan, is a very vocal. He supplies the aftermarket in agricultural machinery. So there's significant issues about access to the technical information. So Canada is also considering a right to repair. And as Tana will speak a little bit more about, the European Union is really the first jurisdiction that has taken formal legislative steps to implement the right to repair through its Eco-Design Directive. So basically in October 2018, they passed a directive that will come into force in April 2021 that will require member states to pass laws that manufacturers must supply spare parts and keep those spare parts available for up to 10 years. And what is also interesting is that they've actually mandated that the repairs must be able to be done with normal tools. So unlike some of the Apple devices where you actually need to have a special Apple screwdriver, which no one else can access, the requirement is that normal tools be able to be used to conduct the repairs. So, and that's an interesting approach because it's very much looking at reduction of e-waste, and it's putting the onus onto manufacturers to make sure that when they manufacture things, they must be able to be repaired. And that's from a design perspective. So we've got movement in the UK as well with... You've
got one slide ahead of yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. That's the EU one, sorry. There's a no screen here, sorry. In the UK, there's also, there's been a Manchester Declaration about repair. There's a lot of repair cafes and there's a lot of movement with, as well, but although I was going to say they were following the EU, but as with Brexit, they won't be, essentially now. And we come to Graham in New Zealand. New Zealand is also discussing a right to repair. Basically, only last year, the Commerce Minister, I have a quote there, essentially a meeting of our Consumer Affairs Ministers in Australia and the New Zealand counterparts had a meeting and they came to agree that the right to repair was a significant issue. So each of Australia and New Zealand are looking at this. So I think what's really important is, in terms of context, is that the time is right for this discussion. In Australia, we have a really healthy repair community, reuse, recycle movement. We have lots of repair cafes. We've got the Brisbane Tool Library. We have Substation 33 doing fantastic work as well. So we have a really strong repair community, DIY people, but also a lot of stakeholders who are interested in repair. We have Guido, as we said, from the Bauer, which is a very strong reuse and repair recycle centre, and we'll hear more about that tonight. And as I said, he's also running the petition, which, sorry, I will go back. There's a petition that Guido has on your website that you can all sign up to if you're interested in supporting right to repair legislation. And just quickly, where we are in Australia, we actually are taking baby steps towards a right to repair. So what we have is, since 2012, the ACCC have been watching the car car repair industry. The availability of spare parts, the access to technical information to repair smart cars has been on the radar of the ACCC. And in 2017, they were put on notice about the failure to share car repair information with third-party repairers. And essentially, the ACCC, through Rod Sims, has recommended that we have a mandatory sharing of car repair information. He acknowledged the sophistication of our cars these days is that it precludes mechanics from actually repairing them. You need to have access to very expensive equipment to access the diagnostics on the new vehicles. So we have currently a piece of draft legislation or a mandatory scheme, and Professor Matthew Rimmer has actually done an excellent submission in response to this, highlighting the strengths of the scheme, but also we acknowledge that there are a number of limitations to the scheme, how it's worded, whether it will just apply to cars, will it apply to light vehicles or bigger vehicles, or it doesn't apply to agricultural machinery, for example. So there's a lot of scope for movement there as well. As I said, we've been talking about the right to repair for a little while in relation to agriculture, and this is, as I said, Jessie at the design school has held this forum back in October about what could we do as designers to work on a right to repair. So where we are in Australia is essentially now we have had a recommendation from the Consumer Affairs Minister to look at the right to repair. So Shane Rattenbury, who has made a referral to the Federal Treasurer, that the Federal Treasurer refer the right to repair in Australia to the Productivity Commission in one of its future reviews. So part of the bringing together of this panel of experts and yourselves tonight is to try and explore this issue more broadly with community and to see how we can help government form a view about what might be an appropriate regulatory response. So just as a last tip, we have both sides of politics at the moment talking about the right to repair. We've had Susan Ley speak about it in Parliament, and we've also had Julie Owens support the Bowers right to repair and calling upon government to take steps around the right to repair. So that's a bit of a whirlwind tour of where we sit within the world. So essentially what I'd like to do tonight is just really turn to the panellists and ask each of them to give us a little bit of insight into their experience with the right to repair. And so I might start with you, Leah. Perhaps, given that you're from the home of Massachusetts and the right to repair, can you give us a little bit of an insight as to how that shifted from such a grassroots movement into legislative action?
Thank you, and thank you for that great overview. It's very informative, actually, even for myself to learn about the other jurisdictions. So 2012 sort of marked the victory, but it really started, I think, in the mid-2000s with independent car repairers just really being frustrated by the inability to repair cars. So it sounds like there's a coalescence here as well of just these independents saying my livelihood is really being threatened, and what can we do about it? And there was quite the lobbying taken place. However, it actually didn't, in the first instance, translate into legislation. In Massachusetts, we have a unique political process by which entities or even individuals can petition the state government for initiatives to be put on the ballot for votes by the people. So in this case, the legislature had been asked and had been considering laws, repair laws, for quite some time. I think from 2008, at least 4 sessions of the legislature, and it wasn't going anywhere. And so the movement was able to collect enough signatures. You need over 100,000 signatures, unique signatures, to then put it on the ballot for a vote. And that's how it actually passed, and that required, it basically is a mandate to the legislature from the people to enact into law what they want. And so that's exactly what happened here. So it's sort of this unique process that culminated, but what that did was that then pushed the auto industry into voluntarily agreeing with a majority of automakers in the United States to enter into this memorandum of understanding that then basically used the Massachusetts law as a template, as you were saying, to then provide the same rights all across the country, because the automakers were concerned, and I think rightly so, that other states, if they were to decide to pass laws similar to Massachusetts, they could do things that were slightly different. And then they would be facing a regulatory nightmare of having to abide by 50 plus types of different laws. And so they decided, let's do this ourselves on our own terms. And moving into the digital right to repair, that's sort of the idea behind the movement now, is use that as, try to get one of these states to pass a law which would then bring to the table all these manufacturers who have been since opposing it. And so that's where we are right now with the 20 states with that map. 2020 has proved to have quite the momentum with the state legislatures. Previously, state legislatures weren't having hearings on them. The bills were dying in committee very quietly because of the lobbying efforts by the manufacturers, and I will have to say quiet efforts, right? Very secretive efforts behind closed door meetings with state legislatures. Letters sent directly to state legislatures warning of, all bad things are going to happen if you pass these laws. And now in 2020, we're seeing open forums, open hearings, televised hearings on, televised through C-SPAN and YouTube. So it's been really transformative and fascinating to watch.
Thank you. Taina, perhaps you could just talk to us a little bit about the different approach that the Europeans are taking and putting the onus upon the manufacturers to make repairable goods, which surely that's a great step.
Yes, thank you. Both in EU and in the US, the policymakers are trying to increase the amount of repairs, but I think that the approaches are a bit different. So the recognizing the consumer's right to repair has been a key driver in US, but in EU the motivation has mainly been on waste prevention and in the rise of circular economy. So the consumer's right to repair has only recently emerged as another important issue, I think. But we have now this EU Eco-Design Directive framework, which creates obligation for the manufacturers to provide spare parts and repair information for professional repairers. And it also demands the manufacturers to change the design of the product so they will be easier to repair. And also, I think that it pushes the manufacturers to restructure their supply chains for spare parts. So it's a really remarkable step forward, I think.
Yes. And so from 2021, each member state will have to implement laws?
Yes. Actually, no, they are directly applicable. So they are regulations that are directly applicable. So they don't have to, the member state doesn't have to, they don't have to do anything. Yes. But it also, one very crucial restriction is that these regulations concern only some for household appliances, but I think that we will take some further steps, I think.
Yes.
Let's hope.
So household appliances?
Yes, TVs and, yes.
White goods,
yes,
so
yes.
Fridges and lighting?
Yes, yes. And there are really detailed regulations on each household appliance. That's
great.
Yes.
Matt, do you want to tell us a little bit about your foray into the right to repair from the maker movement and the 3D world as well?
Sure. So I've been kind of very interested in how a rebel alliance of makers, hackers, greenies and digital rights activists have been pushing for the right to repair. In many ways, the right to repair has been previously somewhat crystallised in a former industrial age. It was very much kind of concerned about tinkering with machines. But a range of new technological developments have challenged that. Leanne has kind of talked about the development of a whole wide range of smart devices and the need for software for everything from cars to washing machines. But also we've kind of seen kind of a growing emergence of other technologies like the Internet of Things. There's been a lot of concern that the Internet of Things may be the Internet of broken things. In terms of 3D printing, there has been a kind of emergence of additive manufacturing. So instead of manufacturing things by subtracting things away, you build up things layer by layer. 3D printing involves a certain form of technology that can be used to construct a whole wide range of things. Around that has emerged the maker movement. And the maker movement particularly grew in the United States with the Make magazine and a series of flagship maker fairs. In the 2000s, Make magazine published Maker's Bill of Rights, and amongst other things that was very much focused upon ensuring that items were open to repair. So it emphasised that ease of repair shall be a design ideal and not an afterthought. Some have thought that they're not radical enough, so critical makers and hacker spaces have kind of argued we need more than just merely tinkering, we need a kind of a fixer movement, not just the maker movement. There's been a lot of interest in terms of how 3D printing and additive manufacturing could be used to develop spare parts for all sorts of domestic items. But there's been a larger discussion about how 3D printing and additive manufacturing might be used to make car parts and a range of other products. In terms of digital rights activists, it's been very kind of interesting that the Electronic Frontier Foundation has helped kind of spearhead the push for a wide array of intellectual property exceptions to allow for repairs, not only in relation to industrial designs, but also in relation to copyright and patents and trademarks and technological protection measures. Notably, Edward Snowden, apart from being an activist in relation to matters of surveillance, has been a big champion of the right to repair. In his autobiography, Permanent Record, he kind of talks about the need to be able to know how to fix things. Otherwise, he suggests that you'll be liable to technological tyranny, and if you're not able to fix things, your possessions will possess you. So there's been some interesting kind of high-level political critiques about the need to be able to kind of repair things. It's also worthwhile thinking about who opposes the right to repair, and really big multinational companies have been very keen on trying to control all aspects of their production and use of their products. It's been striking that Apple has gone from being an upstart rebel and challenger to Microsoft and IBM to an admiral. They've gone from having very open personal computers to trying to have a very kind of closed ecosystem in relation to their products. They have been trying to nobble many of the efforts to introduce right to repair. Tesla have opposed the right to repair on safety grounds and are kind of concerned that they don't want people tinkering with Teslas lest people injure themselves. But John Deere and Caterpillar have also resisted the right to repair. The association representing video games has opposed to the right to repair, raising the spectre of floodgates of intellectual property infringement. Also, sadly, the Consumer Technology Association, which used to be a champion of consumer rights, has been an opponent of the right to repair and has been busy supporting the ability and capacity of organisations to control how and where repair takes place.
Thanks, Matthew. Graham, would you like to tell us a little bit more about the tech protection measures, because they're often said to be one of the main barriers to repairs, the fact that copyright owners are using digital locks. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Okay. It's a big topic. I did want to say something about refrigerators first. I just a couple of weeks ago I came back from a holiday on an island off the coast of New Zealand called Aotea. It's called Great Barrier Island. Captain Cook didn't have much imagination. 2 Great Barriers, and there are 3 little settlements. In each settlement there is a book exchange, which is a great thing. Each of the book exchanges happens inside a defunct refrigerator that's there on the side of the road, full of books that can be exchanged. So the problem is endemic. So on technological protection measures, to take a really extreme example, I've got a very ordinary pen here, a biro, but this pen could be set up with software in it that prevents its use if, for example, it doesn't recognise my thumbprint. And if some other thumbprint is used, the pen couldn't be used. So that's a technological protection measure that, imagine a more exciting pen than this, that accessed the software that runs the pen. And consumer goods are full of this kind of software, and it's usually very simple software, but the software is used to protect business models, essentially. And so the classic one that is used is the business model where you buy a cheap printer, but the consumer sundries, the print cartridges, are very expensive. They have little chips in them, so that the one model, the software in the cartridges has to be right, otherwise the software in the printer won't run. And so that's a kind of technological protection measure. So it also impacts the right to repair because very often getting access to the software that has malfunctioned requires breaking through one of these technological protection measures. Now there are, as Leanne put it beautifully in her wonderful summary of this area, there are really 2 problems here. One is a technical problem of just having the technological expertise to be able to break through the lock, to be able to do whatever it is you want to do to repair the goods. That's one problem. There's growing expertise out there in the repair shops of people who can do this with you. For you, sorry. I can't do it. My nephew probably could. Just trying to use somebody from a younger demographic. But there's also a legal problem because in a number of countries there are rules, usually in the copyright law, that say circumventing an access control is what lawyers call a tort. It's a legal wrong. It's an infringement of copyright. So just breaking through the technological protection measure to get access to what is usually very simple software is itself prohibited in the legislation. Now, there are various carve-outs and exceptions. In the United States, every 3 years, the Copyright Office can create rules to create exceptions to that prohibition, and it's recently promulgated a rule creating an exception essentially for repairs for some goods. In the Australian Copyright Act, if you stand on your head and read it, which is the only way to do it, it kind of says that these are not technological protection measures for the purposes of the prohibition. New Zealand the one in Europe is just incomprehensible. It just requires a whole lot of voluntary agreements and with industry to be able to, they expect this beautiful world where product manufacturers will help us all access their, help us all break through the code. In New Zealand, we've got on the books legislation that will align our law with the United States and create the prohibition. It's not enforced, but there's also there's a carve out for TPMs that help make things work, essentially. Now, the thing that I find really interesting about this is the black letter law in those jurisdictions probably doesn't prohibit the right to repair in a lot of cases. So why are people concerned about this? And I think if you're really thinking about a right, you have to think about imbalances of power in the marketplace. And so if you're a small repair shop and you've been told that you have circumvented an access control contrary to the law, and you get a nasty cease and desist letter from the lawyer representing the giant manufacturer of goods, what are you going to do? You're going to settle. You're going to say, sorry, mea culpa, and stop doing what you're doing. So I think that in those jurisdictions I've mentioned, the law suffers from a lack of clarity. And I think, and I'll just end on that point, I think that lack of clarity bespeaks a lack of commitment to the right of repair. If we were genuinely committed to the right of repair, the law will be drafted in a way to say it's blindingly obvious, and we're going to discuss this in the workshop, it's blindingly obvious that this kind of law has nothing to do with and should have nothing to do with ordinary consumer products. It's a useful tool in some parts of copyright law, but it has nothing to do with making a pen work. And that's one of the things that our politicians need to be committed to. Oh, sorry, one more final point on New Zealand. New Zealand is flirting with a right of repair very tentatively. In the meantime, the Ministry for Environment has put forward a very interesting discussion paper on product stewardship. Now this itself shows you something about the politics of this area. We've got the Ministry of Business Innovation and Employment that is in charge of intellectual property. We've got the Ministry for Environment that has promulgated this very interesting set of commitments around product stewardship. What we don't have, and I think what is desperately needed, is an all-of-government response to the area that looks at every area that impacts the right to repair and requires the ministries responsible for the various legislation to get together. The Productivity Commission might be able to achieve something like that in Australia, but that's what's really needed if we're genuinely committed to a right to repair.
Thanks, Graham. Guido, you've got your hands in the repair itself. Can you tell us a little bit about your day-to-day operations and also what you see are the barriers to your repair and recycle?
Sure. Yes. We indeed have the practical side on a day-to-day basis in front of us. So the center I'm managing is called the Bauer Reuse and Repair Center. And it's not for nothing that we call it reuse and repair, to distinguish ourselves from the classic recycling centers. Because for us, recycling is actually not good enough. If you know about waste hierarchy, where a lot of governments, local and state, talk about it as best practice is reuse and repair, but not that many funding and operations are actually looking at that. Most of the waste management happens at the lower level, which is just landfilling and recycling at best. And even there, since the China sword policy came into place, they realized they're actually not equipped in Australia to do some on-site recycling. So it still goes to Malaysia now and other places. But we have always, as the Bauer, distinguished ourselves from that because we look at those items not as waste, but as new products. They can have a new life. And for us, it's all about an environmental program behind it, and not just employment or income streams like Salvation Army will do for revenue for other social welfare programs they run. Because of that approach, we have been investing over the last 20 years since we exist in repairing and reusing items, the refurbishment of items. And we have in-house now experts that do electronic appliances, that do woodwork or furniture, bikes, phones, computers, clothing. And we do that for 20 years, but since, say, 5-6 years, there's a growing interest, and we have picked up on the interest from overseas as well in Europe and in the US with the Right to Repair movement, but also the repair cafes, which we have introduced in Australia, and now you see them at many places. And repair cafes basically sharing the know-how about repairing your own item that we do with you so that you can learn to do it yourself. And there is a growing interest for all of that. But throughout that process of doing repairs, we also have seen more and more protection mechanisms that have been introduced by the manufacturers. For the e-waste, for example, the planned obsolescence is well known. It's deliberately designing products that you can't open them. For us, it's very simple. When there is no screw, it's not meant to be opened. It's meant to be thrown away when it's end of life. That's how they design them. Now, there are tricks and expertise that you can get to go around that. For example, this phone as well has no screw, but there are ways to open it. You have to heat it up. The glue has to be removed that you simply can then undo the seal, but you have to do it in a clean way that you can seal it back and that it is safe again. So there are those ways that you can do it, and that's what our people are experts in. But what we also realize is that this is not going to happen spontaneously. The change to having the right to repair our own goods, to be able to do it in a systematic, in a professional way. So we have been looking at what happens overseas in terms of right to repair initiatives. And we think that there are some interesting examples overseas that could easily be implemented here. And that's what our petition is about on our website. There are two examples I can give. Is in France. In France, they have introduced legislation that every manufacturer who introduces in that country a new product has to put on their packaging for how long they will provide spare parts. And it has to be a minimum of 2 years. Plus also handbooks for repair that you can do it yourself. And that, of course, makes a big difference for a consumer, that you know that you can actually keep it for a longer time, that you can repair it, that there are spare parts going to be available for a certain time. So France introduced it. Germany has taken over. There are a few more countries that will come in. And then there's a European legislation, although that's still only a directive. It's not yet a mandatory thing, which is in France the case. Another example in Sweden is making repairs tax deductible. And they have done it in the first instance with white goods. That if you go for a repair of your white good, you can actually deduct that cost from your taxable income, which creates an incentive. And it makes sense to do that because repairs is actually very labor intense. Whether it is for an electronic or for a piece of furniture, it's very labor intense to do that rightly. And so making that tax deductible allow it to be at least competitive with buying a cheap import from overseas. And that's what we think should happen here as well. And that's what we ask in our petition to the Jos Frydenberg as a treasurer to consider similar initiatives here in Australia. It shouldn't be necessarily the exact same legislation as overseas, but to have that conversation. So, and it's true that some like Julie Owens from Parramatta has picked up on it and has asked the government to have that conversation, that should happen here. So We are quite hopeful. I actually think that whether the government will support it or not, it will happen at some point, because there's almost no alternative to it. And for the simple reason, in one way, that Europe will lead this, and the US as well, and the manufacturers will implement those legislations there, and will then have no alternative than implement it here as well. So, but it could take many years before we are there. And I think this kind of conversations, these debates, and that kind of petitions is important to get that conversation going. That's a bit our story, and why we are sitting here being professors. Can I just chip in?
Yes.
I mean, it's worthwhile kind of noting that there are very real threats to independent repairers in Australia under intellectual property laws. Tim Hicks kind of runs a website called Tim's Laptop Service Manuals, and he posted free and accessible PDFs of manufacturer service manuals online. In response, Toshiba's lawyers sent him a cease and desist letter saying that by posting their service manual up online, he had committed copyright infringement, and he was also in breach of confidential information. And as a result of those threats, he kind of had to take down that repair manual, which would enable not only him but many other repairers to kind of fix that particular laptop series. So it's not merely a theoretical problem. There are very real threats to repairers under certain forms of intellectual property that don't have explicit recognition of the right to repair, like
Exactly.
copyright law and confidential information.
And trademark law, for example, you can't put a sign up to say that you're an iPhone repairer because you're using the iPhone as a trademark. So and there are even there's examples. Leo, you can probably talk more about this, about the trademarks of the manufacturers being imprinted on the very small parts. And so if you actually get access to some of the spare parts, you'll be infringing trademark law by inserting them. Perhaps you can talk about that.
Oh, that's right. So, I mean, going back to Apple, that's exactly what Apple does. So on, apparently, and I'm not a tech person either, but reading up about it, when you have your screen repaired, when you have your cracked screen, sort of the ubiquitous problem that everybody has, and you decide at some point that you don't want to risk having your finger scratched by your cracked screen, you try to go get it repaired. Well, apparently there's a connector that connects the screen to the inside, and it so happens that while there are spare parts for that work just as well, the original part works the best. And on that original part, Apple has placed a very tiny mark that nobody else can see, but that allows them to ban or stop imports of legally purchased, so they're able. So some repairers are able to find distributors outside of their jurisdiction where they've purchased in bulk these spare parts legally, and then in breach of their contract with Apple, they've decided to resell it. But that's not the importer's problem. That's the distributor's problem. That the other, that's the party out here. When it's imported, Apple is able to use that mark to stop that shipment at the border and seize that. And so then that impacts, as Matthew was saying, that impacts the independent repairer, because without that part, they can probably still do the repair. It just won't be as good as they would like it to be.
What's also interesting is in our design law in Australia, we actually have a repair defence. We have section 72 that says you can repair parts to your design product. And for the first time, that came into our law in 2003. It was only recently that we've had that section tested in the courts. And so we've got a decision that's come out and actually looked at the repair defence and how it operates. What's really interesting is it was about car spare parts, and it was basically a company that was providing spare parts to, I would say, this is not a technical term, soup up your cars. to make them a bit flash. And the issue was, well, were these spare parts being used as genuine repairs, or was it really an addition to it? So what was really interesting is that the company providing these parts actually had lots of notices, and when they provided the spare parts, there was lots of information that was also provided saying these parts are being provided for repair, because that was very clearly what they were able to do under the legislation. But they knew that if people are using them for decorative purposes for the vehicle, it wasn't really genuine repair. So that particular decision, although it was testing the repair defence, was all about the onus of proof of did the people who were supplying the parts, were the company who alleged that they were not repairing, could they discharge that onus and prove that when they sold those parts that they knew that they weren't going to be used to repair. So it all turned on that knowledge, essentially, which is not really satisfactory. And what's, in terms of a test of the repair defence, what's interesting we're seeing with design, we have a repair defence, but if you put a computer program into that design product with the tech protection measure over it, the tech protection measure will override that design repair defence anyway. So you've got copyright trumping a repair defence within design law, which is there for a purpose. So it's really interesting, all facets of intellectual property, from copyright to patent law to design, as well as trademarks, are potentially exposed when we're talking about the right to repair. What I thought I'd do is provide an opportunity for a bit of exchange. We have microphones in the audience because you've probably heard from us a little bit of a snapshot of what the right to repair movement is, both internationally and what it means, but we'd like to hear from you and from your stake in this debate, whether it be as a designer, an independent repairer, or a DIY repairer perhaps. Perhaps what challenges you see to a right to repair, or do you not find that repair is an issue, for example? Perhaps if there's any questions, that would be great. We have got a mic. We are recording this evening for those people who couldn't attend, and I do apologise. Michelle Maloney, who was going to join us tonight, is obviously unable to. But there were other people who were hopeful of coming, so we are recording. So if you would like to introduce yourselves, that would be great.
My name's John Tannock. I live in Ferny Grove, and I'm a DIY repairer.
Excellent.
And so, by preference, if anything breaks, I try and fix it myself. Not always successfully, but I wonder, in that DIY situation, to what extent we are exposed to this kind of legal stuff. You could unknowingly use a part you weren't supposed to use or something. I mean, there's a lot of information around from other people doing the same kind of thing, sharing on YouTube, and generally, you know, sort of there's an underground of information supply, which is very helpful. So, as a DIY person, you sort of try and figure it out and get it done. Does the legal stuff only apply to people who are doing it commercially and making money out of it, or do DIY people have to be careful of that as well?
Well, Guido, I'll turn the repair question to you first.
I think it applies to everybody, those legislation, and the impact is there for everybody. Yeah, but there is a case here in Australia even with, again, Apple, that court case ACCC versus Apple, because Apple had been what they call breaking some phones because people have tried to open it and they don't want that. And that leads to what was mentioned there, that there is a secret system that they have built in their phones that they can figure out who's doing that, and then they block their phone. But the good thing is that ACCC went to court and they won actually. So Apple had to pay $9 million to all I think it was 275 people that were impacted by that. So that's a positive example. But it is true that you need to know what you do if you want to do your repairs yourself. And We look at it more from a safety principle for ourselves and for the people for whom we do it than any legislation, because the legislation is not really to the kind of repairs we do applicable. The things with the IPs, intellectual property, is a stage beyond us, because we don't even have the equipment to do that kind of more sophisticated repairs. So the more basic repairs we can handle confidently. We will not be fined for that sort of things, but it is more important that we do it in a safe and a responsible way for the clients who come to us. And that's in itself also an issue, because there is actually, I think, a need for a kind of certification that the way we do repairs would be considered responsible and safe, and that we can have a label like in some European countries exist already, that you then can say we have followed the right procedures. A good example as well is iFix. You might know if you do electronic repairs, but iFix is an American initiative, and they put all manuals that they can get their hands on a website. And all the special tools that you might need sometimes that are not easily available, they have kits for it that you can order, and that helps you to do it yourself. So I would say continue, but make sure you do it in a safe and a responsible way.
Trish, sorry, yes.
Well, I'd just like to continue this one with John and his repair stuff, because he does a fantastic job. And two things came up in relation to cars. So one, we've got two cars, and one car stopped being usable because the windows wouldn't go up and down. They stayed down, and that was very unsafe. He got into it and got it all out and established that it was a little mechanism, which it turned out, this little thing, they wanted to charge about $800 for it, which was crazy. And because he can do electronics, he got in and he took all the electronics apart to have a look at it. And what he found was that now what they're doing with the electronics in cars is, instead of putting wires through a circuit board and soldering it, they're gluing them on with a very cheap glue, which comes off quite quickly. So a thing like a car, which you think will wear out because of the motor breaking down or you've crashed it or something, actually wears out and becomes unusable, because this cheap glue in the window thing that makes the window go up and down has fallen apart after 6 years, and your car's no longer usable. And that was one. And then the other, we bought a new second-hand car, and I was I thought, I think there's a noise in this. And we tried to get it checked under warranty. The only way it could be checked was by Nissan Australia putting it through their electronic device, which they then said, oh, well, that has to be, the electronic signal has to be checked by somebody in Japan who denied who said, oh no, there's nothing wrong with that. Now, there's absolutely no way we could prove or disprove their electronic signal in Japan, and that was it. So we couldn't get it done under warranty. So
no, I think, and that raises a very important issue. The access to the information, or access to the software, the diagnostic software is part of the problem. So if you look into the ACCC inquiry into the car repair industry, some of the findings of the ACCC was essentially around that even a skilled repairer, unless you are paying hundreds of thousands of dollars, wouldn't be able to get the access to that diagnostic technology to find out what is even wrong with your car. So that whole idea of not even being able to begin to diagnose the problem, or relying upon them to tell you what the problem is because you can't double check it. And that's part of that. I think when Graham was speaking earlier about tech protection measures and whether you're able to break them or not, I think legally, and what the consequences might be in terms of a cease and desist letter, I think what's really important in some instances, we know, particularly with motor vehicles, is that any attempt to tamper with the software will actually shut the vehicle down. So it's not a question that you'll get a letter from a lawyer. You can't, the thing won't work. So sometimes the tech protection measures are so strong that the device itself will close down, so you couldn't attempt to modify or repair.
And also the way the legislation is drafted, there are weird distinctions between the software that makes a product run and the diagnostic software, which would be seen as a separate computer program, probably not shielded by the defence, that you need to be able to repair. And so all the way through to answer your question, all the way through this area, the legislation has been drafted in a way that would give lawyers headaches, which is not how you go about crafting a right that we desperately need for not only just for consumers but for the environmental scourge that those kinds of business models create.
Tricia.
Simon from Griffith Film School. First of all, thank you, terrific panel, and respect to my colleagues who put it together. I'd not heard of right to repair, and it's powerful but in this summer, when we all know the hell that has broken loose around us, it suddenly strikes me that we need a stronger legal base than right to repair. It's like planned obsolescence, of which I think this is a version, just should be illegal. Is there any international law framework that allows we the people to say this? We need products that are built to last, where there is the means of repairing them, and if you won't make them, not only we won't buy them, but I mean, am I dreaming? Or is there some legal paradigm that could go beyond the right to repair?
Well, certainly that's the right to repair is one. I think there's so much more, as you say. There's Matthew will probably have some things to add here, but the idea of trying to reach a truly sustainable society in that sense of what can be done. Shouldn't manufacturers say what a lifespan of their products are, for example, up front? This will last for 5 years, whereas this product may last for 10 years. And give credit to consumers that if you are prepared to pay the extra for a product that will last for 10 years, because you know that is better value and that it will last and that you perhaps can repair. So yes, there's a whole raft of things around product stewardship in terms of life cycles. Matthew, I'll open to the panel really.
Sure.
Exactly.
Well, in terms of the international framework, as Leanne kind of talked about, the Sustainable Development Goals kind of play a really important role, and at an international level that kind of informs the work of various different UN agencies. Nation states within the European Union, for instance, take that very seriously and try to think about how their laws and regulations and policies are informed by those goals, and it's very noticeable visiting Finland and Sweden and Norway and Denmark, what an impact that has. By contrast, I think the major parties in Australia have been in some ways quite hostile to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I kind of made a submission to the Federal Parliamentary Inquiry into how Australia should implement the Sustainable Development Goals. And what struck me from that process was the disinterest and the apathy of the major parties in terms of taking on board those principles and thinking about ways and means in which those principles could be adopted. It's been very striking that the great champion of the right to repair in Australia has been Shane Rattenbury, the ACT Attorney General, and he has tried to pitch the right to repair in a stronger form. So he's not been kind of content to think of it as merely a technical exception in intellectual property, but he's tried to pitch it in terms of an expanded form of consumer rights. He's tried to think of it in terms of dealing with questions of e-waste, but he's also been very much concerned with sustainable innovation. So he's been trying to encourage other state and federal ministers to join with him to try to take a much more national approach to those sorts of matters. But in some ways, I think you're quite right. Australia, in some ways, is very much wedded to unsustainable development. And looking at the statistics earlier, we're very kind of greedy in the way in which we use all sorts of different resources, and we have very much a junk economy in many different ways, and we're not necessarily very much concerned about a circular economy or a repair economy or implementing certain forms of sustainable ways of using resources. So I think there's a big disparity there in terms of the debate that we're having about the right to repair in Australia and what is actually happening in terms of the European Union.
I should say we did actually invite Shane along tonight because he's been so instrumental, but unfortunately he had a conflict so he couldn't come. But I think your point, Trish, is so true. And I think what is also important, we have Samuel here who's speaking tomorrow at our workshop. But if you talk to people in developing nations, repair is part and parcel of everyday life by necessity. Even when you speak to farmers and people in rural communities, they don't have the luxury of going to replace or having authorised repairers at their doorstep. So it is by necessity. So it's very much a first world problem of this linear economy that was consumption and waste. Whereas we have developing nations who are taking, we see the piles of discarded e-waste and essentially people are taking the copper out of machines at great risk to themselves, for example. But there is very much a repair ethic in developing nations and rural and remote communities by necessity. Sam, you may want to say.
Yeah, the same way we're seeing, like, for instance, in Europe, right?
Sorry, we have a mic.
Mine.
Yeah. Oh.
Sam?
I think it's on, just talk close.
Just stand up and turn around.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Pretty much like the same way that in Europe we are seeing right to repair being linked to environmental questions, and, like, for instance, in America being linked to civil liberties and independence of, like, repair shops. In developing nations, there's much more a question of access to certain goods and certain technologies, because for pretty much like the bulk of South America, multiple items, they are very expensive. Sometimes they take like 2 or 3 years of minimum wage just to buy. So it's not a matter for them like to buy a new one. Repair, it's always the first option. They need the repair. And ever since, for instance, like the TRIPS agreement, which is an intellectual property agreement that creates standards around the world, like those countries are also like responsible to take care on that. So right now, for like in some developing nations, there are like multiple people being vulnerable to, from one day to another, being arrested, like because they're engaging to repair against like IP rights and against like the intentions of the owners.
Hi, it's Jennifer, formerly from QUT Health Social Work, nursing background before, and this is awesome. I have another pitch from the health perspective, maybe that's not in your department, but I see all this overlapping in health. In artificial intelligence, digital health, NDIS, where does that sit in with all that overlap, like 3D, all of that, for consumers' rights, even in, say, a broad range of demographics and geographics, especially in disabilities? Yeah.
Yeah, there's some really interesting work being done in terms of trying to use new technologies to make affordable medical devices and prosthetics and technologies. I had a chat to MSF, who have an experimental 3D printing lab at a refugee camp in Jordan. They get lots of different patients from the region who have suffered injuries from conflict or landmines, and they've been using 3D printing to really try to develop natural-looking artificial limbs, and that's been a really interesting project. I had a chat to some doctors in the Netherlands, in Neergem, and they have been trying to use 3D printing and bioprinting, both for patients in the Netherlands but also in Sierra Leone. So they've been very interested in how they can have affordable access to medicines using open source technologies. In Belgium, I came across a really interesting group who are very interested in making accessible technologies for those with disabilities, and they were adapting and using with 3D printing and various other technologies to make accessible technologies. But often there is a kind of a clash with much more proprietary approaches in relation to technologies. So we know in relation to medical devices and medical technologies that there has been very strong proprietary control in relation to them, and also in relation to things like drugs and genetic testing and other related technologies. Sometimes there have been fights over the right to repair. I came across a case in the US in which the right to repair had been invoked successfully in relation to a medical matter. A lot of the big medical associations representing industry groups have been opposing the right to repair in the United States, arguing that a lot of the bills that have been discussed by my colleague, they've been introduced, they've been saying, well, you should leave out medical matters, that should be governed by the Food and Drug Administration instead. So there could be a bit of a clash there in terms of the various rights and defences that are available in those territories. But there's some really interesting considerations at play in relation to health and medical matters. And what happens if you have a device that becomes faulty and you need it to be repaired? It becomes a life and death matter in those circumstances. So, and sometimes you have issues, particularly around product liability. You know, what happens when a medical device is faulty? So Johnson & Johnson was recently sued in a class action for making very defective devices. Medical companies are aware of issues around product liability and safety, and that becomes a quite interesting topic for those debates over repair and defective products.
Right, and so just add a note to Matthew's comment about the medical device companies actually have been quite successful in the United States, lobbying to have an exception, a very explicit exception in the various state laws. So California, for instance, their version of the right to repair bill specifically exempts medical devices. And the arguments being product safety, reliability, but the problem, I think, is where then you have medical devices in the rural, underserved areas, and the same problems as farmers and agricultural equipment, where life and death is at stake. So that's quite problematic. Another interesting area that we haven't touched upon yet, but was recently raised in the United States, is the military equipment. An officer in the United States Army wrote an op-ed, an opinion piece, that was gained quite a bit of attention, basically saying repair is a problem even for military equipment, that trained expert technicians are not allowed to repair military equipment in the field when they need it. And that is a huge problem at a greater level than just my iPhone, but not to diminish our needs, and really the human right almost to access to the internet. But that has been something we haven't touched upon, but I think is also out there.
I think that's really significant. I currently have a student who's actually looking at the right to repair in the mining industry, and it's exactly that same point. those massive big machines,
Yep.
very highly skilled technicians
that's
who
right.
work in the mines
That's right.
are not allowed to touch the machines.
That's
And authorised agents from the manufacturers who come onto a mine often have to undertake a 2 or 3 day health and safety course before they're allowed to set foot on the mine. So the administrative time and expense of getting through those hurdles just to allow someone to visit the mine is
Right.
similarly a challenge.
Never mind a war zone or a
Exactly,
conflict
a war
zone.
zone, yeah. Exactly. Sorry. Carl and Eleanor?
Hello. Thank you to the panelists for speaking on a very interesting topic. I have my name is Tal. I'm a student at Griffith University. Possibly the most interesting thing about me is that my best friend and flatmate of a year and a half was an Apple technician, and every day he would come home from work with hilarious stories about people coming in with all sorts of defective devices, and the fact that they would be forced to come to him to pay the large amount of money they would need to fix it. In particular, my 82-year-old grandmother who broke her iPad screen and called me and said, does he think that I can pay someone, third party, to fix this for about $30? And he said, yeah, listen, no, it's going to be a $300 repair or a $400 purchase of a new iPad. And she had to go with that because he was the expert in the field. I have a very half-baked idea that came to me while Graham was speaking, and I'm not sure if this applies at all, about whether the right to repair extends to the insulin issue in the United States, where it goes to pharmaceutical companies and their IP over the recipes, I guess you would call it, or the processes to make insulin, and then people who are trying to create home brews. So a question of whether the medical need is so great as to make direct access outside of company protection is actually legally viable. I don't know who in the panel can answer that best, but it's...
They're two slightly different things. I think in relation to Apple, the ACCC took action against Apple, as was mentioned before, over making false and misleading representations to customers with faulty iPhones and iPads about their rights under Australian consumer law, and they had to pay $9 million in penalties. So the ACCC have been very kind of concerned about that issue. I would argue that really the ACCC need to go further and think about some of their powers under competition law. I think we're really kind of talking about anti-competitive conduct in aftermarkets. But, Apple are very well resourced, so that would be a very significant commitment from the ACCC to kind of take on Apple. And likewise in the United States, the Federal Trade Commission has been having an inquiry into the right to repair and has asked for empirical research and lots of submissions. The Open Markets Institute said, really, the Federal Trade Commission has considerable powers under antitrust laws, and the problem is that they're not utilising them. So that dialogical process was all very well, but really they could be taking affirmative action against Apple and some of the other big IT companies. Your second point, I think, was really kind of getting to the question of confidential information and trade secrets. And it is true, various different forms of IP owners do rely upon trade secrets, in the medical industry and the biotech industry, as well as in relation to IT. There have been stronger and stronger remedies that have been provided for, both under civil law and with new kind of criminal remedies that have been introduced. In opposing a lot of the right to repair legislation that has been coming along, a number of the industry associations have been arguing that they would allow for the reveal of proprietary information. So they have been trying to defend themselves against the introduction of that legislation, arguing that that would lead to an impermissible disclosure of trade secrets information. So that gets you into an interesting area about, well, what disclosures should be permitted under the law to serve other public purposes. But there have been cases in which companies like Toshiba, which I mentioned before, have invoked breach of confidential information against repairers, trying to make public certain kind of critical information. So it's an ancillary form of intellectual property that is becoming more and more important, and with stronger protections being afforded in various different jurisdictions. You might see more actions in relation to breach of confidential information in the future as well.
Just a slightly different take on that, and I'm loath to be the author of the downer in the room, but opioids rightly remain regulated substances, as would pharmaceuticals that are sort of powerful enough to solve addiction issues, and the tragedy of addiction that we're seeing in many states in the United States. And it's important, I think, to bring into the room that realisation of a right to repair would not lead to a completely unregulated space. And I was sharing with the others, I flew across the ditch in a Virgin Australia plane, and I'm quite grateful that repair of aeroplanes that go across the ocean are subject to civil aviation regulations about who can repair them, under what circumstances, and so on. And I think and I think in the pharmaceutical context, those kinds of issues would come up. They would certainly not go away in the medical device area either. What I think it requires is very careful thinking about when there are unnecessary, unfair, and abusive restrictions on the right to repair. Some of those restrictions are going to serve very important societal goals. Others of them are just protecting business models.
So I think we have... Oh,
hi.
Sorry, Gemma, and then Eleanor. Sorry, Eleanor. Sorry.
Hi, my name is Gemma Rodriguez. I'm a PhD student at Griffith University. I'm sorry, I'm a bit nervous. Listening to you all is very interesting because I'm from the Philippines and I learned so much. I understood why sometimes in a year, Australians throw things, everyone puts stuff outside in their house where rubbish not the rubbish, someone collect from the council. So you see fridges, television, the only thing you don't see is cars. But I never really understood, and I thought, wow, this is a country where they throw everything. And listening to you, I understand it now. And so reflecting back to my country is I've never really heard of the right to repair. I mean, I've done human rights work, the right to life, the right to live, but not a right to repair. So is the right to repair only advocated in developing world? Because I have to tell you a story. I don't know if I broke a law in Australia, but I am a bit proud because 2 years ago I actually fixed a lawnmower. It was given to me, and it broke because the grass was about the same half size of me, and I fixed it because I could not afford to actually fix it, And I think the guy too said, "Oh, this is an old mower, it's best you get a new one." But I had to go fixing it. What I did, I took every part of it, and I took a photo because I've never done this. So I could have number one, number two, what it goes. But eventually I fixed it after 6 weeks. And I actually said I should become anyway.
Well, that's a perfect example of being able to fix. I think that's fantastic.
But only because I grew up in a society where we fix everything. We don't see our couch being thrown out. We just fixed it. So I think Australia has a problem because, you just keep making things, and when it's not good, you throw them out, and then it lands actually, I don't know where it's from, Australia. Many of these things are in my country,
Yes.
and then if we can't repair products from other like Apple, then we also have a problem because then we can't fix it. But we are also a bit smart. I know a friend of mine has a BMW, but the engine is Toyota, and I understand now why. But I don't want to talk about further. But is this thing only advocated, in developed world, the right to repair?
I think what you see, there is a repair cafe movement as well, in addition to the right to repair movement. And I think what you talk about, I would see that as an example of the repair cafe movement that has grown in the more industrial world. It actually started in the Netherlands and then all of Europe and the US and now Australia as well. And I think it's not for nothing that it is in those countries that it started, because it's those countries, the wealthier countries, that have a culture of throwing away rather than repairing. And a lot of knowledge about learning how to repair has been lost over generations. People in those countries don't know it anymore, which is different in countries like in Africa, in the Philippines, in Latin America, the same. So that's why those movements grew up, come from the more industrialized countries like Europe and in Australia as well. And it's true, Australia has a culture of throwing away, a big one. We have been saying, I think you said at the start of your introduction, 23 kilo of electronic waste per Australian is thrown away per year. Clothing is 26 kilo per year that every Australian is throwing away. So yes, we are one of the bad examples in that way, in that regard, and it's important that this movement is growing here. I think the right to repair story is actually an additional layer, and I think, in my view at least, the industry is going to step too far. The manufacturers have gone a step too far by introducing all this IP and the software where we have no access. Even we can't, that's what I was saying earlier on. When it's that kind of issues, we have to stay out of it because we can't deal with that. But that is actually a more provocative thing that has an impact, not just in the industrial world, it has a global impact. And I think that's why the right to repair movement is growing and is becoming a strong player now to stop that, because that has a much bigger impact on anybody, on everybody globally, than the fact that you throw away your coffee machine or your small items that are still repairable.
Eleanor.
I'm Eleanor from the law school, and I'm much more into repairing, particularly clothes, because my mother was a seamstress and she was Italian. Mm-hmm. So, but I have a question for you, Matt. You said initially that consumer rights groups were not supportive of the right to repair or haven't gotten on board, and I was wondering why. Is it because of, liability issues in case people are out there repairing? And just another quick question: if we have, if we're moving towards electric cars, are they going to be more difficult to repair because of the technology behind, what makes an electric car work? Or
I think my point before was that the ACCC as a regulator has taken some action but should take more action. I think in terms of the right to repair movement in Australia, I think in some ways it's still rather nascent. So there are some individual repair cafes. Choice sometimes gets interested in questions about the right to repair. But we don't really have the same well-organised civil society groups that we see in the United States, in the European Union, in the United States, in the various different battles that are going on. You see the Electronic Frontier Foundation, iFixit, the Repair Association, a public interest organisation. There seems to be a broader alliance, some of the agricultural groups that Leanne was talking about. So I do think there needs to be a critical mass of a coalition to really take on the very well-funded companies and organisations representing industry groups who are opposing the right to repair. So I think that's a bit of an issue in Australia. We need a kind of a better level of organisation to push through the right to repair. I mean, just picking up the question before, there is a kind of a global movement for the right to repair and to try to accelerate the Sustainable Development Goals. So the United Nations Environment Programme head, Akam Steiner, has argued that there should be innovation centres and accelerators focused upon pushing forward the Sustainable Development Goals in various different ways, to have places that can bring together the community and government and industry to realise some of the goals, like the one dealing with the responsible consumption and production. And David R. Boyd, who's the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, has a series of reforms he'd like to see to promote a circular economy, for action consumers can take, action that governments can take, and action that businesses can take. So he really kind of sees the need for some sort of global action to take place to bring into function a proper circular economy. And he really sees it as very independent or interdependent in terms of the way in which different economies work with one another.
I think, just to follow up on Matt's point, I think you might have been remembering that he mentioned the Consumer Technology Association actually was a big group. It's a big industry group that's not in favour, that actually opposes it, because their members are actually the manufacturers. So even though it's sort of a misnomer, it is consumer technology because we are consuming it, but they're not necessarily in favour of us repairing that technology.
But it's a kind of a betrayal of their earlier values.
That's
so
right,
they used to, for instance, argue for the ability of consumers to time shift and watch what they would like and would take on the IP owners. I guess my point was that they have betrayed those earlier ideals, and really they're acting like some of the big IT companies now, saying that they want lockdown systems. Their membership.
They're now membership, exactly.
But perhaps they've become much more mature industries and think that those companies can benefit more from having very locked down ecosystems in relation to their products.
Can I just pick up your point? Oh, sorry, Grant.
Sorry, I just want to. I think there's an additional point to those excellent points. So in one of the breaks, I was watching the US State of the Union address, because I think it's really important to expose yourself to the ideas of people with whom you disagree. It's very healthy. And so people who talk about regulation and change in legal regimes emphasise that it's extremely important to think about what will be lost. I think this answers a question that you asked early on. What is it that will be lost? And some of that people will value dearly, and I think that's where the resistance is. I mean, I have no sympathy for firms that want to lock us into very expensive repair programs, etc. On the other hand, it's absolutely apparent that in both New Zealand and Australia, a large proportion of the population love stuff. They love stuff, and they might also like things. The ability to go to the market and have the choice of buying an expensive printer with cheap ink or a cheap printer with ink that's locked into some kind of program. They might be attracted to that kind of business. It's similarly with safety. I mean, safety, there's a lot of credence and faith that is associated with safety issues that may or may not be a crock that's sold by the firms, but they're attracted. I mean, I've called it elsewhere the Walmartisation of culture, which is people are attracted to an awful lot of the things that cause problems for the environment and problems for realising the right of repair. Because if you had the right of repair in the printer context, you'd say, cheap printer, expensive ink, that's not going to be in the market. Now, I agree it shouldn't be in the market, but lots of people think it should be. And so we can't dismiss those people as labouring under false consciousness. We actually have to take them seriously and say this is where the friction is to realising that right of repair. So it's not just companies, it's consumer desire.
And just to pick up your point about electric cars, I think what's really interesting is that, and we've got one of my former students who did his honours thesis on the car repair scheme, Lucas, but we don't need to have electric cars for there to be a problem to repair them. We currently have that problem with the telemetry that's in cars, and I think Leah can probably contribute here that the sophistication that's in cars now, whether you're unless you're driving a 1958 Holden, pretty much anything that gives you a GPS map and that plays those ridiculous sounds when you turn your engine on and off, essentially will have sophisticated telemetry. So what we're seeing is that the question is now whether your car gets plugged into a diagnostic machine at your Golf service provider. And what we're seeing an increase now is that information will actually be up in the cloud. So you won't even be able to go access those repairs there. It's similar to the farming issue, that your information and data is actually held up in the John Deere cloud. So you often don't even see it, and you rely upon John Deere to tell you when something's going to break or when you need it. So I think...
There's nothing wrong with my car.
Yes.
So you don't bring it in. I said, I'm not bringing it in.
That's exactly right, because you're tied into a warranty.
Right, and yeah, so, and then actually, so, and what they're doing, further to Graham's point, and what you're looking at with the TPMs, is they're using the entertainment system in your car to funnel the information, the telematic information into the cloud, to wirelessly transmit it. And so that is protected by lots of layers of copyright, not including the digital locks, but also valid copyright protection to the entertainment, the songs, and the all the different apps they're providing you. And that's what they're coming out and saying, well, we can't give independent dealers access to the telematics system because it's the entertainment system. It's one and the same. The other problem too, and this is part of design, is the lack of standardization. So, we got to a point previously, and this was in the United States with the Massachusetts law and then the memorandum of understanding between the auto industry and the repair industry, that everything would be standardized in an onboard system that you could plug any standard USB cable. You didn't have anything special. You didn't have to have special software. You didn't, just a standard, whatever the standard operating software was to diagnose the car. And now, because the law didn't actually references telematics, but not in a standardized way, all manufacturers have their own systems. And they're using it in a different way. And so now, it's not that the independent car dealers can't they could pay lots of money to get access to them, but they don't have that money. And so there's because of the lack of standardization, so there's a new law actually being pushed forward in Massachusetts that Massachusetts voters will get to vote on in March to try to update the law. Part of it is requiring standardization like we've had previously. So we'll see how that goes.
And I think what's really interesting is part of the argument that John Deere put forward in opposition to the 3-year exemptions around technological protection measures was that if you allow a right to repair in terms of agricultural machinery, people will use it to copy music and songs like that, so that they play in their tractors. So there was this kind of crazy, yes, they could copyright content as well. So that was quite a bizarre reasoning.
Absolutely. And so luckily the Copyright Office you said, there's an overriding repair issue here.
Yes.
And there's no evidence to show that farmers really just want to get access to the songs. Yes. But I will say, that brought up a footnote I wanted to make to Graham's remarks about the U.S. Copyright Office's exemptions. So 2 points. One, they're every 3 years, and every 3 years they need to be renewed. Sometimes they don't get renewed. For example, one of the exemptions was that you should be able to access your phone and port your phone number right? So you don't have to get a new phone number every time you want to change carriers, telephone carriers. That they were going to take that exemption away or not renew it. And so there was a whole kerfuffle over that. In addition, this last round, which allowed for repair, only allowed for repairs for the person who owns or uses the device. It said specifically, we do not have the authority to allow repairs or to say that we're going to provide this exemption for repair dealers, so independent repair dealers. We can't say that. So if you want to go and use the repair dealer, you do so at your own risk. And they specifically say that. We said we're very sympathetic to it, but it's not our place. That's Congress's place to do it because of this digital lock law that you're asking us. We don't have that authority. So that they were very, very careful, and you could see very nervous to try to even move beyond what they thought they had authorization to do. So that's still a problem. So they very specifically say, we're not authorizing you to go to a third party. You could do it yourself if you could figure out how to do it.
For students and others here who come from outside of Australia, come from developing countries, the United States lesson is also a very important lesson in terms of regulatory design, because if you can watch the US Copyright Office hearings on YouTube.
Yes.
They're fascinating. I mean, Leanne's adverted to them, but it's an extremely expensive process. It's very burdensome, and there are real experts, particularly from the Copyright Office, in the room. Going through that process every 3 years is really burdensome on overtaxed governments. So if you're thinking about regulatory design in home countries, you really don't want the United States system. You want it hardwired. You want to do it once and you want to do it well. 3-year hearings is just hopeless.
That's right. They've tried to institute reforms to make things more streamlined. So if they provided an exemption in the past, what you need to prove or to show to renew that exemption has been streamlined, but you're absolutely correct. And that's been one of the arguments against having those exemptions and just say, let's hardwire this into the law because it's expensive, it's so resource intensive and wasteful really.
I'm conscious of the time and it's almost 7:30. Perhaps we could have the last 1 or 2 questions. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Natasha, thanks. That was really interesting. I am interested in waste regulation and entirely ignorant when it comes to IP and copyright. Can you explain the extent that these theft protection measures and taking away the physical ownership of goods, how that relates to product stewardship, and waste regulation?
How does it?
Yeah, so I'm just, with the TPMs, you were saying that essentially they are taking away the physical ownership rights.
Yes.
So how does that relate to product stewardship, noting obviously that there's only one compulsory product stewardship mechanism in Australia? How does it relate to waste regulation and product stewardship? Should it be?
Essentially, the argument is the inability to access or to repair those products places them into the recycle and waste stream so much faster than if there was an intermediary step. So the work that John and Rose are doing on product stewardship in terms of making sure that products are durable and last longer, essentially you're cutting those products off right at the very start because there's actually no ability to reuse or recycle because basically they're valueless and they'll literally go from being brand new to unable to be used to landfill.
So does that mean, though, in terms of the ownership transfer, that there is no transfer from the manufacturer to the purchaser? So
No.
say I walk into Officeworks and buy a Brother printer and I go home and I accept all of those things
Terms.
saying, which essentially say this is our product and you didn't just pay $200 for a printer, you paid $200 to let you borrow it. Does that mean that printer is always Brother's possession?
No, in the sense that I think this is the very heart of what, essentially the end of ownership. If you read Aaron Perzanowski's book, and this is the idea that we do physically own it. We have title to the goods, but what does that mean in these days? So if I can draw an analogy with Facebook, people sign up to Facebook. Facebook will say you own all of your content. You own your photos that you put up there, essentially. But the licenses that you agree to when you sign up to any social media platform are so extensive that essentially you give them the right to do everything and anything they want with that content, even though technically you may still have copyright in them. But your license is so broad and so wide that it means nothing to have that residual right, essentially. So in terms of physical ownership, like, I physically own my car, but is there anything I can do with my car apart from drive it? Basically, no. And that's the argument with the farm machinery, is that I spend $1 million on these pieces of equipment, but really, they're on my land. I would be better to have a rental agreement and basically drive it around than to invest that money, because can I do anything with it that I normally could? When you buy a book, you can read it, you can, loan it to someone, you could rip a page out, you can edit it, you can draw in it, you can do all of these things with a hard copy book. But if you're looking at an e-book, with all of those restrictions on it, one of the favourite things, I think, when we talk about tech protection measures, one of the very early versions of Adobe Reader's Alice in Wonderland e-book, if you read through the license agreement when you got that e-book, one of the last clauses was, you may not borrow this e-book, you may not loan this e-book, you may not share this with friends, and you may not read this book out loud. So that is a perfect example of contracts and tech protection measures that go way beyond what the copyright right you have in a story, for example. So that's exactly what we're seeing, is that when you buy a product, you have that product, but you can't do X, Y, Z with that product. So you own it, but do you really? And that's that question. What is ownership with digital goods these days?
Thank you.
Perhaps one last question, and then we appreciate your contributions and times. Oh, sorry.
Hi, my name is Eleni Kalanidou. I'm from QCA Design, and I've been working in that field for 5 years now. And I've been running in circles for various reasons with repair. I introduced a digital platform 5 years ago that gives access to users to services of repair, reuse, because I see repair as a waste management practice. And back then I interviewed repairers, and I discovered that the legislation is not only related, the lack of legislation is not only related to the right to repair, but how we sustain repairs as well. So a lot of them complained about the fact that with health and safety issues, it was way too expensive to create a space to repair, A. B, it's very expensive to get apprenticeships because of the health and safety issues. So that creates an extra problem in terms of having more repairs, professional ones. And the third problem is there are not any incentives for the young generation to learn how to repair professionally. So in that sense, there's not, we have a lot of incentives and easements in terms of recycling, but there are none in terms of repair and reuse. So I think that I'm looking at Guido because I know that you have that experience from...
But it's correct what you're saying, that's our experience as well, and that's the conversations we are having with the politicians and with the governments now as well. All their money in New South Wales, for example, $60 million is available for waste management, but it all goes to recycling. There's not $1 available for reuse and repair. They make promises and they talk about it as if it is available for that purpose, but it isn't actually available. It's only for recycling and for illegal dumping that they want to stop, but for reuse and repair there's actually no money yet available. And that's indeed a problem, and there's no place where you actually can learn repair now. You need to do it on your own. you need to play with it, take some risk now and then. But that's how we actually work ourselves. We have been training in-house our own people. We can't learn it elsewhere. We just do it ourselves and bring in new people. And now we have a pool of close to 50 people that are all in-house trained to do all sorts of repairs. And that's the only way that you can actually keep going with it. But this is for the traditional type of goods. When you talk all the IP and the software programs, then we have to pass, because that's beyond us as well. We can't do anything about that.
And I think you raise a really important issue that we haven't really spoken about tonight, but it's certainly been raised by the repair community, and that is the issue of insurance, public liability insurance. How do you, we've got tinkerers who travel around Victoria who do a fantastic job repairing. They'll go to a church hall and tell everyone in the regional town to bring along anything that's broken, a clock, a sewing machine, whatever it might be, and they will have a go and help you repair that. But the hall will require them to sign indemnities or take out insurance, and so the availability and facilitation of repair is an insurance issue for a lot of organisations and for a lot of individuals as well. So what are the insurance companies doing to assist people and organisations who are trying to assist with repair? So I think that's a really interesting question.
I mean, it's really important not just to think about right to repair in a very limited, narrow, technocratic sense. I mean, I think to sum up, the speakers tonight have really been arguing that you need to engage in an array of regulatory reform if you want to boost circular economy. We're a little bit stacked with intellectual property academics, so there's been a lot of discussion about intellectual property and the right to repair, and that's really important to deal with. But alone, that is insufficient. You also need to deal with consumer rights and competition policy. You need to think about waste management and environmental law and sustainable development. You need to think about international law. You need to deal with product liability and insurance and risk. Really, if you want to have a strong version of a right to repair, you need to dance across all those different disciplinary regimes and have a concerted approach that will promote a circular economy. And unfortunately in Australia, many of our regulatory regimes are not very good at meeting that objective. Perhaps the European Union is a little bit more holistic in its approaches to bring together some of those different issues. But in Australia, we're dealing with the right to repair in a very ad hoc, fragmented way. And I think that's rather problematic at the moment in terms of our approach to the issue. We're often posing shadow solutions because we're perceiving the problem in a quite limited way, and perhaps we need to take a more European approach to the topic.
Exactly. This is a very final question, if it's a short one. I apologise for going over time, but I wouldn't like to close down the discussion.
Thank you. I'm Fiona Fitzpatrick from the Griffith Law School, and it really has been a fabulous evening, really interesting. So I do agree with Graham, and I think that the root of the problem is often that so many people work so hard to buy things they don't need to impress people they don't like. That's one of the old adages that I think, the consumption is really the root of it. But also in relation to the right to repair, I think in developed countries it's a sustainability issue, but in developing countries and even in the central, in Central Australia, it's a survival. They don't have the cash to go and get a new product. I hope everyone has seen Bush Mechanics, and if you haven't, you really should, because it's incredible how they keep cars going in Central Australia with Spinifex and String. But I had a couple of and I don't expect an answer, but just a couple of things that occurred to me. One was the warranty issue, and one was how if you tinker with one part of a product, then can the manufacturer void your warranty for the whole product? Say our friend here has fixed his door, and I suppose I'm just hoping that you feed this into your considerations, and I'm sure you have. And the other thing that occurred to me is under the consumer law, something has to be fit for purpose. And I'm wondering whether anyone has tested fit for purpose in relation to the duration of the time that something should last for. But they were just the two things that occurred to me.
In terms of the Australian consumer law, we were only discussing this today. Yes, the consumer guarantees around fitness for purpose and merchantability. I think the issue is more to do with lifespan. So yes, these products are probably fit for purpose and merchantable, but the question is for how long should they be? So before they are designed to essentially the product obsolescence issue of, well, we know that they will fail after 12 months, for example. So I think, there's certainly work that can be done in the Australian consumer law with consumer guarantees. I mean, we've been talking about a right to repair. We don't have a Bill of Rights in Australia, and this has already been said to us, that there is no Bill of Rights in Australia, so how can you have a right, for example? There are many different forms of rights in terms of where the power to repair will sit and how best to facilitate repair. The language of right to repair is very much come from the US, and essentially that it's really because it's not so strong in Europe, and that's what I think is interesting in the way that the Europeans have gone forward. It's not such a consumer right as such, but it's more an issue, an overarching environmental sustainability, which, as Matt said, goes to the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think that has a lot more kind of leverage in terms of rather than just a consumer right.
Yeah, the ACCC did take on LG and they took on Apple. The LG litigation was very messy, but the ACCC did win on certain points in the end. But what they extracted out of that was that consumer guarantees exist in addition to the manufacturer's warranties. So the ACCC have been trying to take on companies who have been trying to say that they don't have any kind of particular obligations beyond their warranties by emphasising that the consumer guarantees continue on. But a lot depends on how the judiciary kind of consider some of these matters in relation to consumer rights. I was heartened by the recent litigation over Dieselgate in Australia, in which Volkswagen was sued for misleading deceptive conduct by having defeat devices to cheat their reports in relation to carbon emissions, but they also engaged in all sorts of misleading deceptive advertising as well. And there was a settlement that was brokered and the judge said it wasn't big enough and it needed to be a larger settlement. I guess that case is heartening in the sense that the judiciary is taking the view that there should be strong action taken against companies who engage in misleading deceptive conduct and make misleading and deceptive representations. And I think someone before was kind of talking about advertising and consumer capitalism. You know, if companies are engaging in misleading and deceptive representations by their madmen of advertising, there should be action taken against them by regulators or through class actions. And in the Dieselgate case in Australia, there were both action taken by the ACCC and through class actions. So maybe consumers need to band together to try to take action in relation to their consumer rights in the future, in addition to regulators taking action themselves.
Thank you. I might take this point to thank you all for coming. We really appreciate the interest because for some people, the right to repair still doesn't really make a lot of sense. We have heard people say, oh, we're not sure what you're talking about. So we're really appreciative of having some interested people along tonight to hear more about it. And I'd really like you to join with me in thanking our international visitors and speakers and our panel members. I should say particularly Leah and Tina are doing extremely well because they have travelled halfway across the world and jet lag is hitting them probably 3 hours ago. But they've only recently arrived as well. But thank you to each and everyone for contributing tonight. And we have recorded this evening, so we will share that up on the website. So have a good evening and thank you again for coming.